antiseptic masked the stench of burnt ozone and copper. Dr. Arthur Hayes didn't look at the crown resting on the stainless steel tray. He kept his eyes locked on the ruptured thorax of the alien heir, his gloves slick with turquoise fluid, wondering if today was the day he died. The operating theater was too bright, a sterile white expanse that burned the retinas and offered nowhere to hide. Arthur's lower back was a tight knot of screaming muscle. He had been standing on the anti-fatigue mat for 11 straight hours, and the promised relief of the expensive synthetic rubber had worn off around hour 4. Beneath the blinding glare of the surgical lamps lay Clara. The neural translator implant nested at the base of Arthur's skull supplied that name, converting the complex, multitonal clicks of her actual title into a digestible Western equivalent. To Arthur, she was just the patient on the table, a terrifyingly fragile assembly of unfamiliar anatomy that he was currently trying to put back together. She was of the sovereign caste of this sector, a species that vaguely resembled humanity if humanity had been forged from porcelain and spun gold. Her skin was a translucent, iridescent white, completely devoid of pores, with a network of thick, metallic gold veins pulsing weakly just beneath the surface. Right now, that skin was split wide open from her collarbone to her lower abdomen. Clamp, Arthur rasped. His throat felt like it was lined with shattered glass. The automated surgical assistant, a multi-armed robotic contraption affectionately dubbed the Mantis, whirred and handed him a titanium hemostat. Arthur's hands, normally steady, betrayed a microscopic tremor. He gripped the tool tighter, forcing the exhaustion down into his boots, and secured the arterial line that was leaking thick, cyan fluid into her chest cavity. God, they are so fragile, he thought, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his shoulder. The textbooks had lied. The anatomical charts provided by the Terran Medical Guild were based on archaic scans and guesswork. The Vaughn, as they called themselves, didn't allow human doctors to dissect their dead. Arthur was flying blind. He had already discovered that her heart wasn't a single organ, but a dual-chambered pump separated by a thin, cartilaginous membrane that was currently tearing under the strain of trauma. She had been caught in a localized kinetic blast, an assassination attempt, obviously. Shrapnel made of compressed carbon had shredded her royal escort and turned her torso into a slaughterhouse. Pressure is dropping, the automated suite chimed in a pleasant, perfectly modulated synthetic female voice. Cyan loss approaching critical threshold. I can see that, Arthur snapped, his voice echoing in the massive, hollow room. Increase the synthetic volume. Push 20 milligrams of epinephrine, or whatever the hell the local equivalent is. Just keep her heart squeezing. He reached into the chest cavity. The texture of her internal organs was wrong. Instead of the wet, squishy compliance of human tissue, Clara's organs felt like dense silicone, rigid and resistant. His fingers slipped against the slick, cool surface of her liver, or the organ serving that function as he searched for the source of the hidden bleed. The air smelled violently of copper and the sharp chemical tang of the cauterizing laser. Every time he burned a bleeding vessel shut, a tiny plume of gray smoke rose into the ventilation hood, carrying the sickly sweet scent of roasted alien proteins. It made his stomach churn, reminding him that he hadn't eaten anything but a stale protein bar in 20 hours. He found the tear. It was hidden behind the secondary lung. A jagged laceration, leaking fluid at an alarming rate. Suture, he demanded. The Mantis placed the needle driver in his hand. Arthur went to work. It was mechanical, repetitive, brutal labor. There was no poetry in surgery, no grand, heroic orchestration. It was plumbing. It was tailoring. It was trying to plug holes in a sinking ship with nothing but thread and stubbornness. He threw stitch after stitch, his knuckles white, his eyes burning from the harsh lights. He didn't care about the crown. He didn't care about the geopolitical implications of a dead princess. He just hated losing. He hated the arrogant finality of the flatline beep. Tension holding, he muttered, tying off the final knot with a sharp tug. Cauterize the margins. He stepped back, letting the automated suite spray a layer of biosealant over the organs before the long, arduous process of closing the ribcage began. Arthur dropped his bloody instruments onto the metal tray. The clatter was deafening. Vitals stabilizing, the suite reported. Heart rate entering acceptable parameters. Arthur ripped his surgical mask off, gasping for the sterile, heavily filtered air of the room. He leaned over the scrubbing sink, gripping the cold steel edges until his fingers ached. He stared at his reflection in the mirrored surface of the supply cabinet. He looked old. Gray was creeping into his dark hair, and the bags under his eyes were bruised and heavy. He was 38, but the frontier had aged him a decade in half the time. He had saved her. Against all odds, he had stitched the broken porcelain doll back together. But as the adrenaline began to bleed out of his system, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache in his bones, Arthur felt no triumph. He just felt a deep, creeping dread. Because in a monarchy this brutal, you didn't just save a life and walk away. You became part of the ledger. The sonic shower felt like being sandblasted, but it scrubbed the cyan fluid from his cuticles and the smell of ozone from his hair. Arthur stood in the tiny, utilitarian locker room attached to the Royal Medical Wing, buttoning up a fresh, gray uniform. His fingers fumbled with the clasps. He wanted a cigarette. He hadn't smoked in 5 years, having traded the habit for cheap frontier coffee and a low-grade dependency on sleep stims. But right now, the phantom craving gnawed at his lungs. The heavy metal door of the locker room hissed open. Arthur didn't turn around immediately. He could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of armored boots. It wasn't the soft, padded stride of the medical staff. Dr. Hayes. The voice was a deep, synthesized rumble, translated by Arthur's neural implant from a series of guttural clicks. Arthur grabbed his jacket, slinging it over his shoulder, and finally turned. Standing in the doorway was a Von Royal Guard. The translator matrix designated him as Commander Blake. Blake stood nearly 7 feet tall, clad in articulated obsidian armor that hummed with a faint kinetic field. His pale, gold-veined face was expressionless, his eyes solid black orbs that betrayed nothing. "Commander," Arthur said, his voice dry. He picked up his data pad. "If you're here for the post-op report, the princess is stable. She'll need at least 3 cycles in the hyperbaric tank to encourage cellular regeneration, but the vascular grafts are holding. I've uploaded the schematics to your medical division." "I am not here for a report," Blake said. The massive guard stepped aside, gesturing toward the corridor with a heavy, gauntleted hand. "King David requires your presence in the Zenith Hall." Arthur's stomach dropped. King David, the sovereign ruler of the entire sector, a being who had wiped out 2 neighboring star systems over a trade dispute involving raw deuterium. "Now?" Arthur asked, looking at his wrist chronometer. "It's 0300 hours, local time. I've been in surgery for half a day. I need sleep, Commander." Blake did not move. He did not blink. The kinetic hum of his armor seemed to pitch slightly higher, a subtle, auditory threat. "The king requires your presence. Now." Arthur sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He was a contractor for the guild. They were supposed to guarantee his safety, but out here, 50 light-years from the nearest Terran dreadnought, contracts were just digital paper. If the king wanted to execute him because the princess had a scar, the guild would send a strongly worded diplomatic protest, and Arthur would still be dead. "Lead the way," Arthur muttered, pocketing his data pad. The walk to the Zenith Hall was a blur of oppressive, brutalist architecture. The Von did not believe in soft edges or comforting aesthetics. The palace was carved directly into the side of a massive basalt mountain. The walls were jagged, dark stone, illuminated by harsh strips of white LED lighting embedded in the floor. There were no windows, no tapestries, no art. It was a fortress designed to withstand a siege, not a home. The air grew colder as they ascended, the temperature dropping until Arthur could see his own breath pluming faintly in the air. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic strike of Blake's boots and the softer shuffle of Arthur's rubber-soled shoes. They reached a set of towering double doors forged from solid tungsten. Blake placed a hand on the biometric scanner. The heavy doors groaned, parting with a hiss of equalizing pressure to reveal the throne room. Arthur stepped inside, and his breath hitched. The Zenith Hall was cavernous, vast enough to house a Terran dropship. But it was completely empty, save for a raised dais at the far end. There were no courtiers, no sycophants, no guards, just the king. King David sat upon a throne of raw, jagged iron. He was massive, larger even than Blake, draped in heavy layers of crimson fabric that seemed to absorb the light. His skin was a darker shade of the iridescent white, marred by decades of battle scars that cut through the gold veins like dry riverbeds. As Arthur approached, the king leaned forward. The smell of the room hit Arthur then. It smelled of old blood, ozone, and an undercurrent of something sharp and metallic, like an overheating engine. "Dr. Hayes," the king said. The translation implant struggled with the sheer volume of the king's voice, the words vibrating against Arthur's ribcage. "Your Majesty," Arthur said, stopping a respectful 20 paces away. He didn't bow. He was a Terran citizen. He gave a sharp, professional nod. The surgery was a success. Clara will live. David stared at him. For a long, agonizing minute, the alien monarch said nothing. The silence stretched, pulling taut. Arthur fought the urge to shift his weight. He kept his hands clasped behind his back to hide the lingering tremor in his fingers. "The physician cast of my court declared her wound fatal," David finally rumbled, his black eyes boring into Arthur's. "They said the carbon shrapnel had compromised the dual valve, and that attempting to repair it would merely prolong her suffering. They suggested I grant her a swift death." Arthur felt a flare of professional irritation burn through his fear. "With all due respect, your physicians are butchers with good PR. The dual valve was compromised, yes, but they lack the microsuturing techniques to rebuild the membrane. I utilized a synthetic mesh graft. It's a standard Terran procedure. Difficult, given her unique physiology, but not impossible." David tilted his head. The movement was predatory, like a hawk studying a field mouse. "You speak with arrogance, Terran." "I speak with exhaustion, Your Majesty," Arthur countered, too tired to filter himself. "I'm a mechanic. I fixed the engine. Now, if we are concluded, I'd like to discuss the transfer of my hazard pay so I can catch the next transport out of this system." The king stood. The sheer size of him was terrifying. He descended the steps of the dais, his crimson robes dragging silently across the polished basalt floor. He stopped mere feet from Arthur. The metallic scent was overpowering now. "You do not understand our ways, Dr. Hayes," David said softly. The translator matrix caught the nuance of the tone. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. "In our culture, blood is a ledger. A life taken is a debt owed to the state. A life saved is a debt owed to the savior." Arthur frowned, a cold knot forming in his gut. "I operate on guild contracts. My fee was established before I scrubbed in. 2 million Terran credits transferred to my guild account. That's the only debt I care about." "Credits are a fiction," David dismissed, waving a massive hand, numbers on a screen. "They carry no weight, no honor. You have returned the heir to the sovereign line from the void. You have bound her life to yours through the spilling and sealing of blood. I really don't." "I have spoken to the High Council," David interrupted, his voice rising, bouncing off the cavernous walls. "The ledger must be balanced. You have given me back my daughter. In return, the crown bestows her upon you." Arthur froze. The words hung in the cold air, taking a moment to penetrate his exhausted brain. When they did, all the air left his lungs. "Excuse me?" Arthur said. His voice was a pathetic, reedy whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. I think there's a translation error. My implant must be glitching." "It sounded like you just said you're giving me your daughter." King David did not smile. The Vaughn lacked the facial musculature for it, but the hardening of his black eyes conveyed his total lack of amusement. "There is no error. Clara is bound to you. Where you go, she goes. You are her warden, her protector, and her master. Her life belongs to you, as you are the one who forged it anew." Arthur took a step back, his hands coming up in a placating gesture. Panic, hot and frantic, began to claw up his throat. "Whoa, wait, stop, no, absolutely not." Blake, standing by the doors, shifted his weight. The kinetic hum of his armor spiked aggressively. "I am a doctor," Arthur said, speaking quickly, desperately trying to inject logic into a nightmare. "I live on a transport ship. I eat reconstituted soy paste, and I sleep in a bunk that smells like industrial solvent. I am 3 million credits in debt to the guild. I cannot take care of a princess. I don't want a princess. I want my money. You refuse the royal gift?" David's voice dropped an octave, the sound vibrating in the floorboards. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet another 10 degrees. "I am politely declining," Arthur corrected, sweat prickling his hairline despite the cold. "It's a generous offer, truly, but I am not equipped culturally, financially, or emotionally to own another sentient being. That's slavery, Your Majesty. Earth law strictly prohibits it." "You are not on Earth," David growled, taking a step forward. He loomed over Arthur, a mountain of kinetic armor and old scars. "And it is not slavery. It is the ledger. By saving her, you stripped her of her sovereign independence. She exists now only because your hands willed it. If you refuse her, you declare that her life has no value. You declare that you stitched her together only to insult the crown." Arthur stared up at the alien king, his cynical mind racing, looking for an out, a loophole, a way to defuse the bomb strapped to his chest. But there was nothing. The Vaughn were literalists. They didn't do metaphor. They didn't do nuance. "If I refuse," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "what happens?" "If you refuse, the insult is absolute," David stated. "I will have Commander Blake sever your head from your shoulders. Then, because Clara's life was deemed worthless by her savior, she will be euthanized. The ledger will be wiped clean." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at David, searching for a bluff, but the alien's black eyes were empty voids. He meant it. He would slaughter his own daughter, the one Arthur had just spent 11 agonizing hours putting back together, just to satisfy an archaic accounting error. "You're insane," Arthur breathed. The words slipped out before his survival instinct could stop them. Blake drew his kinetic blade. The weapon ignited with a violent, electric crackle, bathing the far end of the room in harsh blue light. David raised a hand, stopping the guard. "I am Vaughn. We survive because we do not leave debts unpaid. Choose, Dr. Hayes. Claim your reward, or claim your death." Arthur closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw the blinding lights of the operating theater. He felt the slick, unnatural texture of her organs, the desperate, thumping rhythm of her dual heart fighting to stay alive. He remembered the sheer, stubborn refusal in his own mind to let the flatline win. He was cynical. He was tired. He hated the galaxy and everything in it. But he was, at his core, a doctor. He preserved life. He didn't throw it away. He opened his eyes. The exhaustion settled over him like a heavy, leaden blanket, crushing the fight out of him. "Fine," Arthur spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and defeat. "Fine, I accept. Put her on my tab." David nodded slowly, the tension in the room instantly evaporating. "The ledger is balanced." The king gestured to the side of the room. A massive, heavy door that Arthur hadn't noticed slid open. 2 medical attendants wheeled in a grav stretcher. Arthur's breath caught. It was Clara. She was conscious, barely, propped up on a slight incline. The biosealant covering her chest glowed faintly beneath a sheer, silk-like medical drape. Her pale face was drawn tight with pain, the gold veins pulsing erratically at her temples. Her eyes met his. They were not solid black like her father's, but a deep, fractured violet. Arthur expected to see royal fury. He expected to see disgust at being handed over to a grubby, exhausted human mechanic. Instead, he saw raw, unadulterated terror. She looked at him not as a savior, but as a warden. Her hands, resting on the white sheets, were shaking violently. She knew the law. She knew she was now property. Arthur looked from the terrified alien girl to the stoic, immovable king. A bitter, ugly taste filled his mouth. He had saved her life, and in doing so, he had ruined both of theirs. Bring her, Arthur said to the attendants, his voice flat, completely devoid of emotion. He turned his back on King David, unable to look at the monarch for a second longer. Keep the IV lines clear. We're going to my ship. He walked out of the Zenith Hall, the heavy tungsten doors hissing shut behind him, sealing his fate. He didn't look back to see if they were following. He just listened to the soft hum of the grav stretcher trailing behind his heavy footsteps, the sound echoing like a death knell in the empty corridors. Arthur Hayes had come to New Gaul to clear his debt. Instead, he had just acquired the heaviest anchor in the galaxy. The Genoa was not a ship built for royalty. It was a decommissioned freighter, retrofitted into a mobile trauma center, and it smelled exactly like what it was: a tin can steeped in 5 years of stale coffee, industrial bleach, and fear. Arthur guided the grav stretcher up the boarding ramp, his boots clanging heavily against the grated metal deck. The atmospheric scrubbers kicked in with a wheezing groan, fighting a losing battle against the scent of New Gaul's sulfurous air bleeding through the airlock. Behind him, Clara lay perfectly still. She hadn't made a sound since they left the palace. "Watch your head," Arthur muttered, mostly to himself, as he navigated the stretcher through the narrow corridor. The ceiling was low, lined with exposed piping bundled together with yellow zip ties. He punched the keypad to the medbay. The sliding door stuck halfway, grinding on a bent track. Arthur kicked it hard with his heel. It shrieked and slid open. He shoved the stretcher inside and hit the locking mechanism. The room was tiny, dominated by an auto dock bed that had seen better days. The monitors were cracked in the corners, held together by clear tape. "All right," Arthur breathed, running a hand over his face. He felt the coarse, oily stubble on his jaw. His eyes burned with a dry, scratching heat, transferring you to the primary bed. "It's going to jostle. Hold your breath." He didn't wait for a response. He gripped the edges of the silk-like drape beneath her and heaved. Clara gasped. It was a sharp, clicking intake of air, followed by a low whine that vibrated in her chest. Her hands flew to her abdomen, hovering just over the fresh biosealant. The metallic gold veins on her neck pulsed frantically, swelling against the translucent white skin. Arthur ignored the pang of guilt. Sorry. Had to be done. He began hooking her up to the ship's telemetry. The human-grade sensors struggled to read her biology for a few seconds before the software patched through the conversion matrix. Her dual heartbeat populated on the screen. Thump, 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 thump. Fast. Too fast. Arthur looked down at her. She was staring straight up at the ceiling, her violet eyes wide, her jaw clamped shut. She was shivering. The medbay was kept at a standard Terran, 20 degrees Celsius. To Yvonne, whose planet was a frozen rock, it should have felt comfortable. "Are you cold?" Arthur asked, pausing with an IV tube in his hand. "No, master." The words were spoken in English, heavily accented with a clicking undertone, entirely bypassing the neural translator. Arthur dropped the tube. It bounced against the metal tray. He leaned over the bed, bracing his hands on the rails, bringing his face close to hers. "Do not call me that," he said. His voice was a harsh, ragged whisper. Clara flinched, her eyes darting to his face, terrified. "I apologize. Owner? Lord?" The translator matrix in my education cycle was, "Arthur," he interrupted, grinding his back teeth together. "Call me Dr. Hayes. Call me Arthur. Call me, hey, idiot. I don't care. But if you call me Master, I will sedate you for the entire trip to the Outer Rim." She blinked, the violet irises contracting. "But the ledger is bullshit," Arthur snapped, pushing away from the bed. He paced the 3 feet of available floor space, running a hand through his greasy hair. "Your father is a psychopath who used you to balance an imaginary checkbook. You are not my property. You are my patient. You're only here because if I left you there, he would have killed you." Clara slowly turned her head to follow his movements. The sheer, terrifying logic of his statement seemed to short-circuit her royal conditioning. "My father is the king. His will is the law." "Well, his jurisdiction ends at the airlock," Arthur said, pointing a finger at the heavy steel door. "On this ship, Biology is the law, and right now, your biology is a mess. Your core temperature is fluctuating, your white cell equivalent count is through the roof, and you are radiating stress hormones. Why are you shaking? Clara looked away, fixing her gaze back on the ceiling. She swallowed hard, her throat clicking. I am anticipating. Anticipating what? The extraction of value. She said it so flatly, so matter-of-factly, that it took Arthur a second to process the meaning. When he did, a wave of profound, nauseating disgust washed over him. He looked at the fragile, broken girl on the bed. She had been raised in a society where life was currency. She believed she had been given to him as a reward, a biological spoil of war. She was waiting for him to claim his payment. Jesus Christ, Arthur whispered. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, fighting the sudden, overwhelming urge to break something. He walked over to a supply cabinet, pulled out a thick, thermal foil blanket, and threw it over her. He tucked the edges roughly under her shoulders. Listen to me, Arthur said, his voice stripped of the cynical edge, leaving only raw exhaustion. I am a mechanic. I fix broken things. That's it. I don't want to own you. I don't want to touch you. I just want to go to sleep. He grabbed a pre-filled syringe from the tray and injected it into her IV line. What is that? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. A mild synthetic opiate. It will numb the pain in your chest and force your brain to power down. Sleep, Clara. Nobody is going to extract anything from you on my ship. He watched as the drug hit her bloodstream. The frantic pulsing of her gold veins slowed. Her eyelids fluttered, heavy and uncoordinated. For a brief second, the stoic royal facade slipped entirely, and she looked like exactly what she was, a terrified, wounded kid far from home. Thank you. Arthur, she slurred. The syllables clumsy on her tongue. She was asleep before she finished the sentence. Arthur stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the ship and the rhythm of her erratic heartbeat. He looked at the blood drying under his fingernails. Then he killed the main overhead lights, leaving only the soft blue glow of the monitors, and collapsed into the roller chair in the corner. He didn't even take off his boots before unconsciousness dragged him under. The alarm sounded like a dying animal. Arthur jerked awake, his heart hammering against his ribs. The medbay was bathed in strobing red emergency light. Disorientation hit him like a physical blow. His mouth tasted like pennies and old bile. Warning. Proximity alert. Undocking sequence initiated without clearance. The ship's AI droned in a calm, maddeningly cheerful voice. Arthur scrambled out of the chair, his knees popping. Computer. Cancel sequence. Override. Override denied. External tractor beam engaged. The Genoa is being expelled from the docking bay. Arthur swore violently, grabbing the edge of a console to steady himself as the ship violently lurched. The floor plates screamed in protest. The Vaughn weren't just letting them leave. They were throwing them out. They were catapulting the ship out of the station's gravitational pull to ensure the transaction was finalized. Prepare for FTL jump in T-2 minutes, the AI announced. Navigational systems locked to Terran Sector 4. They slaved the nav computer, Arthur realized, panic finally piercing the fog of exhaustion. A forced FTL jump without proper inertial dampening spool-up would feel like being put through a centrifuge. For a healthy human, it meant severe nausea and ruptured capillaries. For a Vaughn recovering from massive open-chest trauma, he spun around to look at the bed. Clara was awake. The G-forces from the brutal ejection were already pinning her against the mattress. Her hands clutched the sheets, her knuckles stark white against her iridescent skin. The monitors above her were a chaotic mess of spiking graphs. Thump, 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 thump. Her dual heart was in overdrive, trying to compensate for the sudden, crushing pressure. The biosealant covering her sternum was stretching, turning a sickly shade of purple. Arthur, she gasped, her voice barely a whisper over the roar of the ship's engines. I'm here, he shouted, fighting gravity to cross the 3 feet to her bed. He grabbed a harness from the wall and dragged it over her chest, trying to secure her without putting pressure on the wound. FTL, jump in, T-minus 30 seconds. Your heart can't take the pressure differential, Arthur yelled, his hands flying across the medical console. He was flying blind again. He had no data on how Von physiology reacted to crude, unbuffered slipspace jumps. I have to slow your metabolic rate. I'm going to push a heavy paralytic and an ice saline flush. Clara's violet eyes widened in sheer panic. No! Paralysis is death. The ledger. Forget the damn ledger, Arthur roared, slamming his fist onto the console. The plastic cracked. He leaned over her, his face inches from hers, gripping her shoulders. He could feel the terrifying heat radiating from her skin. Look at me. Look at my eyes. She locked onto his gaze, her chest heaving. I am not letting you die, he said, his voice dropping, fierce and absolute. Not after yesterday. Not after what I sacrificed to get you out of there. You are going to trust me. Do you understand? She stared at him, the fear warring with a lifetime of conditioning. But in his bloodshot, exhausted eyes, she didn't find a master demanding obedience. She found a stubborn, angry man refusing to accept defeat. She gave a tiny, jerky nod. Good, Arthur grunted. He slapped a heavy auto-injector against her thigh. FTL jump in 3, 2. The paralyzing agent hit her system instantly. Clara's body went entirely slack, her eyes freezing wide open, locked on Arthur's face. The monitor screamed as her heart rate plummeted, dropping to a sluggish, agonizingly slow crawl. 1. The universe ripped itself in half. The Genoa slammed into slipspace. The sound was a deafening metallic screech that rattled Arthur's teeth in his skull. The artificial gravity failed for a split second, tossing Arthur upward before slamming him brutally back down onto the deck. His chin hit the metal floor hard, splitting the skin. He tasted hot, fresh blood. He ignored it. He dragged himself up by the rails of Clara's bed. The ship shuddered, the hull groaning as it settled into the FTL stream. The red emergency lights flickered and died, replaced by the flickering, dim white overheads. Arthur spat blood onto the floor and looked at the monitor. Her heart had stopped. No, Arthur breathed. No, no, no. Come on. He grabbed a localized defibrillator paddle, a crude, heavy piece of Terran tech meant for human chests. He dialed the voltage down by half, praying he didn't fry her delicate neural network. Clear, he shouted to the empty room, pressing the paddle against her upper chest, just above the biosealant. He triggered the discharge. Clara's body arched violently against the harness. Arthur stared at the monitor. A flat, solid green line. Damn you, Arthur snarled. He cranked the dial up to human standard. He didn't care about the risks anymore. He was operating on pure, desperate adrenaline. Clear. Thump. The discharge filled the room with the smell of ozone and burning hair. Clara dropped back onto the mattress. Arthur held his breath, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the paddle. On the screen, a small, jagged peak appeared. Then another. Thump. Thump. Thump, thump. The dual rhythm reestablished itself, weak but steady. Arthur let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He dropped the paddle onto the floor and slumped against the side of the bed, sliding down until he was sitting on the cold metal deck. His chest heaved, his lungs burning. He reached up and wiped the blood from his chin, smearing it across the back of his hand. Minutes passed. The ship hummed its steady vibrating tune, safely wrapped in the slipspace corridor. Arthur heard a soft rustling above him. He looked up. Clara's head was turned toward him. The paralytic was wearing off. The harsh, erratic pulsing of her gold veins had settled into a slow, rhythmic glow. She looked pale, exhausted, and incredibly small in the oversized medical bed. She looked down at him sitting on the floor. She saw the blood on his face, the dark bruises under his eyes, the sheer, unadulterated fatigue etched into every line of his face. She didn't see a conqueror. She didn't see a master. "You are bleeding," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its musical cadence. Arthur let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He rested his head back against the metal siding of her bed. "Yeah, I guess I am." "Why?" she asked. It wasn't a question about the physics of the jump. It was a question about him. Why fight so hard? Why take the damage? Arthur closed his eyes. The smell of ozone was fading, replaced once again by the comforting, awful scent of stale coffee and bleach. "Because I'm a doctor," Arthur murmured, his voice heavy with sleep. "And because I hate your dad," he heard a sound from the bed. It was soft, a series of short, clicking exhales. It took him a moment to realize what it was. She was laughing. It was a weak, painful sound, but it was real. Arthur kept his eyes closed, a faint, cynical smile touching the corner of his bloody mouth. They were light years from nowhere, stuck on a garbage scow, bound together by an insane alien law and a stitched-up heart. It was a disaster. But as the Genoa hurtled through the void, Arthur thought that maybe, just maybe, they would survive it. That's a wrap on Dr. Hayes and Princess Clara's chaotic escape. If you loved this deep dive into gritty sci-fi survival and reluctant bonds, smash that like button and share this video with your friends. What do you think awaits them in Terran space? Will the King's Ledger haunt them? Drop your theories in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a chapter of our HFY stories. Stay stellar.